Hi everyone, I'm John Cooper. I'm a lecturer at Solent University in sports coaching, and I'm going to talk to you today about whether coaching is seen as effective or could be seen as bullying. Now, within this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about what is sports coaching, some of the behaviours and contexts which we see coaches use and use within, and then we're going to pose some questions at the end which might help us to consider whether coaching is appropriate or is suitable for the athletes or participants that are taking part. So firstly, just to start, what is sport coaching? Well, the ICCE or the European Coaching Council would state that sports coaching is an ongoing process that's structured around improvement, developing participants, especially within a single sport, could be multiple sports, but it's that nurturing and educational support which results in clear and notable signs of development as a result of being involved with a coach. A slightly different concept or definition would include that coaching is an individual that's in regular contact with one or more individuals, participants or athletes, regularly for a period of time, potentially at least a season, with the goal of developing some sort of skill, whether that's mental, physical, technical or tactical within the sport. So essentially what we can take from this is that sports coaches are individuals who support participants or athletes to develop their skills, whether that's nurturing them in an educational fashion or supporting them within a particular sport. And their role within that is to create notable signs of improvement or essentially being a positive influence that allows the participant to improve or develop as a result of that interaction. Now, this is a very dynamic and complex interaction. The coach brings factors to the table, the athlete or participants bring factors to the table, and the way in which they interact is often unique and different across the multiple contexts. There's no perfect situation, there's no repeatable situation which always occurs. In some ways, they're always a bit different. So the way we use our coaching behaviours and the way we develop that skill and ability over time has to be sort of developed and adapted, which could be seen as a form of like structured improvisation. Whilst there is a structure to it and there are clear things we're trying to achieve, there's an element of flexibility and adaptability to it that makes it movable and improvisable to the individual, the context, the sport, maybe even just the weather that day. There are lots of things that we have to take into account. Now, when we're observing coaches or when we're watching coaches perform or practice, there are some explicit behaviours which we can see which are notable, whether they provide verbal instruction or give repeated instructions or cueing, whether they're observing performance. So what are they looking for? How long are they looking for? How many individuals are they looking at? Are they watching the group or are they watching the game? How often do they give feedback, or what types of feedback do they give? When do they give it in relation to performance? Is there an element of athletes providing the feedback, or is it all delivered from the coach? Practice design is another really, really big one. How do coaches shape the practice or the competition environment so that athletes or participants are enjoying it, having fun, maybe developing those skills? That concept of development is all shaped around what things athletes are performing, and the other behaviours are around how do coaches support them in performing those behaviours. However, there are also a number of implicit behaviours or things which we can't necessarily identify just by watching, but are also there underpinning the sort of coaching practice, and that might be a coach's relationship with their participants. So whether or not we have a positive relationship where we both mutually enjoy taking part, or whether that relationship is somewhat performance related and we are both having some kind of input towards a performance conversation or having a meaningful addition to the complex dynamic. There might be some subtle cues which are used, which are potentially, a silence, for example, may not be observable, but an athlete may perceive that silence as either I'm being watched, or they're not happy, or even just they're not paying attention. There are also some like intuition which comes across, and how coaches perceive situations can often be very different. So just being aware that the coaching practice is a form of explicit and implicit behaviours which are often all perceived by the people taking part, and that a lot of coaching practice is seen as sort of adapting and trying to follow a structure, but also being flexible and allowing that to suit the situation. Now, when we refer to a situation, we can often look at this in terms of a specific context And usually within research, there would argue to be three very clear and identifiable concepts. The first being participation. This kind of coaching is largely of low intensity, low competition involvement, and generally tends to be at a lower performance level than others. It largely promotes introduction to the sport. So there might be some basic skills or like basic gameplay, or generally just sort of turn up and play. There's very little emphasis on competition performance, rapid skill learning. It's basically supporting people being involved in sport. Now, this tends to as well include the participants are less intensively engaged. So they're not necessarily trying to become elite level performers. They're there just to enjoy themselves and have fun and take part in sport, either as for health or just because it's fun. Development coaching is typically seen as sort of the next stage on from that. And this might be, for example, where a young child is taking part in their after school club and they think it's really fun, and then they go and join a club or they get selected for an age group academy. And this is where it becomes slightly more focused on preparation and competition involvement. The performance standard has increased slightly, and there is a much greater focus on rapid learning. How do we increase their skills and abilities within physical, technical, tactical skills and mental skills as quickly and as efficiently as possible so that they can develop within the sport. This form of coaching also includes an increased engagement from the participants. Participation maybe once, maybe twice a week, sort of regular, whereas development coaching might be 3, 4, 5 times a week. Typically, this involves sort of club level or age group sports, and it includes being involved within a developmental program or an academy system or something similar, which involves them being part of a club that is trying to encourage, or part of a program that's trying to encourage that rapid development. And finally, there's performance coaching. This is where both coaches and athletes are intensely and highly committed to the performance. Usually this involves like full-time or performance athletes, and those are people who are trying to compete and win games essentially. Usually this is more appropriate within adult performers than it is within younger performers, and it requires much more stable coach-athlete relationship. So the coach will typically be their coach for a longer period of time. There's a much greater focus within performance coaching on medium or long-term planning, or even really long-term planning, so anywhere from a season to a 4-year Olympic or Paralympic cycle. It tends to be much more intensive for the coach. There's much more monitoring. There's much more fundamental decision making that goes into how do we shape the individual or the team towards winning or towards performing at their best. There's a lot more management skills around sort of facilitating or structuring an environment, because that's one that everyone is heavily and intensely invested in. So when we're talking about these kind of contexts, then that improvisation or structured improvisation looks a little bit different for each one of these environments based on the nature of the participants and what they're trying to achieve through taking part in sport, whether that's learning and trying to potentially become a professional athlete, or whether they're just doing it for fun, or if they're already a professional or someone who's being paid to play and trying to win games. That interaction looks very, very different. Something that's also worth noting is that the behaviors that we use become more or less appropriate based on the individual that's within these environments. So for example, if we look at participation coaching, if it's a young children taking part, we should adopt a highly inclusive focus. So can we get everyone involved for a long period of time? Can we support a mastery-orientated climate? This is where we promote athletes or participants to be gaining motivation from achieving more skills or learning something new or being the best that they can be, rather than being focused on beating others as their primary source of motivation or winning games. There's a really high focus on opportunities being safe, optimizing fun, having really low levels of organization. So it doesn't need to be serious. Can they be playful? Can it just be, really minimal stress for people to take part and actually just great fun? Can there be at some form of development of really fundamental movements or fundamental sporting skills that allow them to take part in other sports or potentially just sustain their participation in sport for a period of time? And can it also promote that social fun aspect of sport and bring the kind of camaraderie and start enjoying sport and sampling lots of different sports. Whereas for older age groups or adults, participation coaching might just be, here's an opportunity to come along and have fun. Can you just interact with people socially? Can you give opportunities where adults can playfully compete and enjoy competition, but with the primary focus being to have fun? It might be to promote the opportunity of taking part in sport and developing their health and fitness. You might end up teaching some sport-specific skills, but generally they're skills which help people take part in sport for a long period of time rather than trying to push them towards a professional level. And can you provide people social assets and citizenship through taking part in sport and support their personal identity? So these are sort of ways that behaviours might be shaped to support this type of coaching with these individuals. Whereas for more performance coaching, for young adolescents, we might have to look at the sporting experience a bit more, try and focus a bit more on the sport, the rules of competition. Apologies, in the top left that should say performance coaching. We offer opportunities for fun, but especially within those young adolescents, you want to increase that level of learning and then increase their physical, technical, mental skills, their perceptual skills, but do so within a safe environment. We're trying to also really encourage positive growth. So can they engage? Can they take responsibilities? It's important to note here that children are not usually involved in a performance environment. That's where the phraseology of young adolescents comes in. It's not appropriate for young children to be seen as performance athletes. They're still growing, they're still learning, they're still finding themselves within sport. We can't really place that same expectation on them. Whereas for older adolescents and adults, so potentially 16 to 18 and up, there's probably a more focused training regime, which is grounded in being efficient with your practice, allowing athletes to take rest, but also prepare them for consistent performance at a high level. We're still developing those multiple skills, and we even potentially within adults might be preparing them for life after sport. So what I hopefully have highlighted here is that coaching is multifaceted. There's a lot going on, which is formed by an aggravation of our capabilities as a coach, as well as the needs of the athlete and team, and the context in which they're taking part in sport. Now, when does good coaching become poor practice? Well, in the way in which we improvise and structure our coaching, it needs to suit those age group individuals or genders or different backgrounds, as well as the context in which they're taking part in sport. And a few questions I wanted to pose to you just to get you thinking is, well, how do we know how much or what type of practice is most suitable for each of those contexts or participants? How much attention or feedback, those explicit behaviours, should a coach be giving to participants? A level of challenge can be provided, because that could be quite fun, but how much challenge should be provided? And support. Coaches are there to facilitate and nurture people developing through sport, but how much support should be given? If our physical training is too much or inappropriate, it could be excessively tiring. We could lead athletes to cause injuries. If this happens repeatedly, this could be seen as a form of physical abuse or intentional bullying, especially if particular individuals are being trained more than others. Or if, for example, a particular athlete always gets given punishment runs, which I'm not advocating that behaviour, but if that happens, their training might be subtly different to someone else's or significantly different, which could be excessively tiring to one individual versus others. Failing that, if we don't practice enough or don't do the right type of practice, it might not be fun. They might not want to take part. Or for our elite performers, they might be underprepared for competition, which could be seen as a form of neglect or not supporting them effectively. If we think about coaches' attention like a spotlight, if we focus that attention on one individual for a long period of time, you could be seen as favoritism, or it could be, that's probably more in a positive light. In a negative light, you could be incredibly critical to one individual for an extended period of time, which again feels like they're being isolated, could be seen as bullying. That being said, also, if that spotlight is being placed on certain individuals, that means that it's not being placed on others, which could be seen as exclusive behaviour or, excluding people from being supported or developed. That could be also seen as like a lack of support or, again, a form of neglect. When we come to challenge, this is a really tricky one, and one that I think we always have to focus on. But how much effort is being placed on challenge? And if we challenge athletes too much, there could be too much pressure being placed on them, especially at an early age or in other contexts. They might not need that pressure. It might push them too far out of their skill set and not allow them to successfully develop. It could just be too much too soon. Whereas if we don't use enough challenge, it could be boring. We might not be developing them. And if we're not supporting them or helping them to develop, then we're just not really having that positive involvement that coaches should be having. We also might not be able to deal with setbacks. And I think it could be seen as a lack of, if they're dependent on the athlete, on the coach, or if they're unable to deal with situations, could that be a form of like almost delayed bullying where we haven't supported them to develop the skills necessary to take part in sport? Finally, when we come to support, if we give too much support, it could be controlling. The athletes might become dependent on the coach, and that dependence, again, could be seen as a form of, a failure to allow the athlete to be in control of their own lives. It could be very controlling. Whereas if we don't support them enough, it could be a very harsh or exclusive environment that could be very negative for people to take part. So we're going to talk much more about these questions in the live session later on. But hopefully these will just start that element of consideration from you to think about what this could be. Thank you so much for listening. If you're interested in our sports coaching course at Solent University, feel free to follow that QR code as well as our other courses. And if you just want to see what our students get up to on the course, feel free to follow us on the Instagram page using the tag below.